And now the floor is on to Florian Forestier, who will moderate the first roundtable, as well as the 4 speakers. If you can join us here.
So we will have the first roundtable with Fritz Bussemaker, Fernanda Martins, Selina Bottino, and Alison Gilwald. Benchmarking for insight. What do previous multi-stakeholder regulatory cases teach us about how to regulate digital platforms for information as a public good? So, thank you very much. As you heard, I'm a bit sick, and we had an epidemic on this roundtable because my co-moderator is sick too, and so she could not come. But we will try. We will try. So though maybe digitalization constitutes a global and systemic transformation whose effect will be equivalent to those of the invention of the printing press and the industrial revolution combined. Or maybe, on the contrary, it is a multitude of small, local, contextual transformation. As technology becomes structurally authoritarian, all these questions are complex. The regulation of social networks pose so specific and complex challenges. On the one hand, social networks are eminently global phenomena, but at the other end, at the same time, they are also extremely local. Their effects are inscribed in the media and economic ecosystem of a country, of a region, in a social and political context, in a culture. What type of regulation to introduce for such a complex situation? Regulation in other areas than the online platform can maybe serve not as example as benchmark stuff and as inspiration. Useful examples could come from the field of climate and biodiversity regulation. Christophe already mentioned that. Public health, biodiversity, or maybe finance, or media, such as press and television. The process of creating a suitable regulation in each of these fields involved precisely identifying the effects that were to be controlled, sharing secure metrics, establishing a channel connecting experts to the people making the decision. To talk about this today, 4 world experts. First, Fritz Bussemaker, chairman of the Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age, and Fernanda Martins, director of the Internet Lab, Selina Bottino, director of the Institute of Technology and Society, for Technology and Society, and Alison Gilwald, executive director, Research ITT Africa. So first, I will Bussemaker.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting us to speak at this most important conference. I'd like to take a little bit with the history, how we founded that in itself, how we want to proceed. The Institute for Accountability was founded by pure accident. Let's say a serendipitous accident, the Netherlands accident. City of The Hague wanted to assess what its position was on fixing justice in the digital age. Same time, UNESCO, the late Dr. Henriette Banerjee, who was at the time the Director of Knowledge Societies, wanted to address the growing gap between the fast developing digital technology and the legal and regulatory framework. And that gap was growing, that created an accountability issue. I happened to be part of both discussions, and that led to the instigation, the foundation of our institute. We started off with an inaugural summit in the Peace Palace in 2018, and we invited a multi and global stakeholder discussion, basically to do a couple of things to raise, to raise awareness for discussion. Mind you, in 2017-18, bringing digital technology, ethics, and legal together in one discussion was still a fringe activity. Those were separate siloed discussions. So we needed to bring that together. We also realized that as an NGO, we not necessarily always look at rules and regulations as the solution. There are other, let's say, 21st century solutions you could go for with this 21st century issue. Also, we realized we need to bring in a business community. And I'm just wondering, who of you in the audience here has a business background? Okay. That just proves my point. There's one or two people in this room, and I think they would have a very key role to play in getting this happening. Most importantly, the last thing I want to say for last is why we were set up, because, and this is, I'm quoting UNESCO, I'm quoting Henry Banayi. If we have this discussion, remain that within the walls of the UN agencies, we don't have the time. It takes time, and we need space of time. And I'll give you a brief example of what I experienced a couple of years ago. I had the opportunity to have a very brief conversation with Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House of the States. As a lawyer, I asked him, what's your position on digital technology and accountability in the digital age? And he gave it a second thought. He said, well, it's just another innovation. It's just like the car 100 years ago. When the car was invented, we didn't have any rules or regulations. And we spent about maybe 10, 20 years developing the rules and the logs so we could drive on the road safely. We had about 150 people in the room. 100 of those people thought, hey, that's a very valid thought. It's just another innovation. And over time, we'll find a way to get this resolved. About 50 people in the room, a minority, realized that that's actually one of the key hidden issues we need to focus on. We don't have 10, 20 years to develop those rules. Technology is moving too fast. So that means we need to think about, let's say, 21st century solutions for this 21st century issues of regulating the internet. And that's also using technology to govern technology. It's one of the solutions we propose. So in our discussions with over the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years even, in this multi-global stakeholder discussion, we've seen over and over again, technology will be part of the solution. The role we have as an institute is we don't own the discussion on accountability. We all do. That in itself is a problem. That somebody needs to take ownership. We all have to take ownership. We also don't want to present ourselves as the subject matter expertise. We're not. We have expertise in the room, but we have to listen to all the expertise that's out there and look at what we have in common. So we need the patience to look at what we have in common and find common solutions. Finally, our position is also, it's easy to found something, but we do not want to have an eternal life. So at a certain point, we want to stop as an organization. That puts pressure on us to have a program mindset and become action-oriented, get things done. So that would be my advice to a lot of those institutions out there. At a certain point, ask yourself, am I still relevant? Do I still contribute to the discussion? So put yourself under pressure. I'll leave with comments for now.
Thank you very much. So I will
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Florian, for organizing this conference. As mentioned, my name is Fernanda, and I am one of the directors of Internet Lab, a think tank based in São Paulo, Brazil. During the last decade, the existence of Internet Lab has been mixed with the complexification of understanding what, how, and why we need to regulate platforms. In Brazil, our organization was born when the Marco Civil da Internet was approved. And now, after crossing happier and sadder moments in our democracy. We are almost celebrating 10 years of the Marco Civil and consequently of the internet birth. A lot of things changed, you know. Past the 10 years, the concerns that we have are so different from the worries that we had in the past. But as you know, with each step we walk, we need to deal with the fact that the technology dynamics is so fast that the feeling of being late is the rule, not the exception. The challenge to think about 10 years behind us is like traveling in time. And maybe this is a little bit of the movement that I will propose to you this morning. Please enjoy the feeling of diving into recent, not so recent Brazilian history. Feel free to use your imagination. Brazilian history sometimes demands it for us. The year was 2014, and our main concerns were related to building the internet as a place to provide freedom of expression. To that, considering the authoritarian waves that mark the construction of Brazil as a nation, one of the topics was to avoid and mechanisms that legally incentivized providers to remove content from users because of the fear of being held liable because of them. The movement was clear. The fact that justice in Brazil is moved in favor of rich and powerful persons, we need to guarantee that platforms won't exclude content trying to run from financial and legal sanctions, because we will probably see marginalized groups be disproportionately affected. To this point of view, after Marcos built the internet, the legal comprehension is platforms will be held liable by third parties content only if justice determines the exclusion of content, and platforms don't do that. In a participative process with academics, civil society organizations, legislative and executive members, and companies, the construction and approval of the Marco Civil da Internet were considered a landmark because it was the first law of Brazilian internet governance. At that moment, it was a clear achievement. I can imagine that part of you remembers it because Marco Civil was an inspiration model to other countries and other stakeholders. I don't need to ask you to close your eyes and imagine what would happen to us in the years to come. Brazil, as well as other countries, was immersed in a democracy crisis. Yet, despite facing challenges, the digital rights field maintained itself structured. For this reason, we could see advances related to privacy, cyber crimes, and data protection concerns. Approved in 2018 and sanctioned in 2020, the General Law of Data Protection was another chapter of this history. Although the law covers several other issues not concerned with the digital field, passed 4 years after Marco Civil, we were able to address another type of question. One more time, one of the concerns that the law awoke in Internet Lab projects was the look at data protection and difference of this enforcement when facing structural inequalities. For example, we asked, what would law enforcement cover different social classes similarly? Would the state respect the privacy of low-income families? Do you have enough transparency from platforms to know how much our data are protected? Considering the political context that we were inserted in, The opportunities to demonstrate the research results and demand change were shorter each time in the public sphere. In parallel with the approval of the second law, as mentioned, Brazilian democracy, step by step, was suffering the attempt to kidnap their democratic institutions. The democratic play became a huge and polarized dispute around the social consensus on what gender equality, human rights, family, and freedom of expression are. Internet in general, and specifically platforms with a large reach, were appointed as the main ones responsible for the increasing extremist right emergence or the communism threat, depends on the perspective. After 3 years of Bolsonaro's government, the elections approached and the hot debate related to COVID-19 policies, disinformation, hate speech, and decrease of episodes of political violence online and offline brought us an attempt for blocking content moderation, especially when against allies and narratives of the same president. The Bolsonaro administration presented an executive order with this goal. It's backfired. Although the Senate and the Supreme Court refused the measure, this attempted to block content moderation as well as the regulation of platforms was not more a theme that engaged only specialists, academics, and people who work in civil society organizations. It also demonstrated that the platform's ability to manage content policies is key for supporting a minimal yet precarious public sphere. It was disseminated in general society the doubts about how and if the democratic process works. For this, some questions were raised. Why are some contents removed and not others? Is it democratic to know exactly the reason for having content removed from our profile? Legit mores like transparent necessities were mixed with conspirational theories. These theories were responsible for discrediting, for example, the electronic vote machine. Suddenly, the questions about an impulse to dissolve and attack democratic institutions are combined with the search for adjudicating guilt. The place of a complex look at the social phenomenon involved polarization of Brazilian society was hairy. Some subjects were more important than others. Disinformation was the subject at the moment to progressist political field, while freedom of expression was the subject elected by far-right field. Analyzing the user's behavior on message APIs, Internet Lab research realized that the problem isn't the lack of comprehension of fake news. Brazilian population understands how to check information. The problem is what they consider as a true source of information. During the 2022 elections, the temperature of disputes between different political players demanded in the Electoral Superior Court more than usual. The elections begin from the Electoral Superior Court efforts to work with civil society organizations and platforms. A public commitment was made, assuming platforms would take more presence in combating attacks directed at electoral integrity. In this process, it was relevant to realize that content moderation couldn't be the only answer that we have. 2022 elections occurred, the conspiracy theory continued, disinformation and political violence were present in all process, but we could guarantee that electoral results were institutionally respected. But in this process, we understood that content moderation is not the only answer. For example, when we deal with transgender people in elections, the main way to attack this population is use the wrong pronouns. So how we can consider these using only AI? It's not possible. We need to combine it different techniques to solve this problem. And in Brazil, during the 2022 elections, we see the Electoral Supreme Court change the scenario, but this problem was focused on only person, the president of the court. And the president pressured more the platforms that were usual. But in this process, we could ask some things. For example, Alexandre de Moraes, pressured the platform to remove content in a couple of hours. But what president was open with Moraes' decisions? And there is the other situation that the court in Brazil is occupied by different political views. So if we change the president of the court, what happens? I need to finish, but I want to ask you two things finally. Considering our structural problem as a country built its history with the suffering and inequality that crossed all institutions, is it possible to make a platform regulation guaranteeing that a radical change of political views and public power will not affect all definitions of human rights and freedom of expression that we defend? Second, because of the similar history of Latin American countries, is there anything we can do together? How can we combine national and regional ways to improve platform transparency and have, at the same time, minimal principles to guide our democracy, respecting national sovereignty? I don't have the answers, but I know we have much to discuss together today.
Thank you very much. So now we will have Celina Bottino.
Hello. Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and happy to be the second Brazilian speaking here, and which is, I think, very important to. There, I was talking with Fritz before, saying, why are there many Brazilians? And maybe I'll try to explain a bit because of our history of internet governance regulation initiatives. So first of all, my name is Celina Bottino. I'm project director at ITS Rio, which is the Institute of Technology and Society back in Rio, not São Paulo. And we also completed 10 years this year. And the mission of ITS is to study the impact of technology and society and how Brazil and Global South countries may respond creatively to the opportunities provided by technology, and also how the potential benefits are broadly shared across society. So we are very much intertwined with the history also of internet regulation, as our directors were very much key actors on that process. So here I'll bring like 3 examples from Brazil as we're talking about high benchmarking for insights. One will be the drafting process of Brazil Internet's Bill of Rights, which is the Marco Civil, which Fernanda just mentioned. And then another experience of the Superior Electoral Court, just tackling information just on these past elections, and also the creation of the Special AI Bill Commission of the Senate to try and regulate AI. And I'll try to conclude in thinking how we can move forward with other, inspired by other solutions on how to get this conversation going. So first of all, the Brazil Internet Bill of Rights, which is this regulation based on 3 pillars, right? Freedom of expression, privacy, and net neutrality. And it's interesting to know that it was proposed as an alternative to a legislation that wanted to criminalize conduct online. So first, they were trying to it would be a crime to like download music. And at the time, there was no regulation involving in online interaction. So there came the idea of saying, well, before we get to the criminal perspective, let's try and regulate it from the civil perspective. And that was when this idea was created. But I would just like to emphasize some characteristics of this process, which was cooperative, multi-stakeholder, transparent. It has like a time, not rushed, and a timely frame, and also led by a legitimate governmental body. First of all, it was based on a corporation. On different stakeholders participated in this open consultation process. There were 2 rounds of consultations. First, with some topics were put to discussion, and then in the second round, the actual draft of the text was made public to receive comment. And this comment was made, and for people to participate, it was also accessible. So it was used several web 2.0 tools at the time to make it more inclusive and also transparent, and to really engage in a multi-stakeholder perspective as all different actors participate, including regulators, private sectors, companies, and also academia, and including like librarians. You could see if you wanted to make public, like who was really participating in that discussion. And that was very important because it helped to reduce the information asymmetry and also facilitate negotiation, which made the process transparent. As it was open, the position of different sectors were finally known, which was possible to reduce, again, this asymmetry of information. And actors eventually, you could see that some actors eventually changed their position during the process. For example, the Ministry of Justice changed its position about log records. ISPs and telco companies, they agreed to disagree on net neutrality, for example. But then you could see that no stakeholder had it all it wanted, but using this multi-stakeholder approach, it created the opportunity for collaboration, also to come up with a text that all could live with and were feeling part of it. And the process took some years to be completed. I know we're at a different time now. We don't have 10 years to come up with a regulation for platforms. But again, we have to know what will be the necessary and minimal time frame that will be acceptable to have this process. And also, and one other point to make a context is that what pushed finally this bill to be approved was an external factor, which was the Snowden mass surveillance revelations, which included President Dilma at the time, who was spied upon. So then was the idea of we have to have a response for that. So that was back in 2014. And just to conclude this, the process of the market review, I think it's also important to emphasize the consensus building, right? There was, which this process was considered like a success because the law still stand today, despite of the initiatives to attack it. But since the drafting was involved all these characteristics that I mentioned, it makes it stronger still today. So the second example would be the Brazilian Electoral Court initiative to deal with disinformation in this past election. So they created this special group with one having like kind of a CFO in leading the project, which he would had the technical understanding of how information network was spread. And the court signed several MOUs with platforms including TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, all of relevant social media platforms. And part of the MOU was several digital literacy initiatives, as well as a possibility to expedite the process of content removal during election, as Fernanda was already mentioned. So, but then which content should be removed, right? So they created this special open channel that people could report content, and which would then analyzed and then sent by the court to the platforms to so that they could deal and remove that content. And so they received more than 100,000 URLs and indications, and which were analyzed, narrowed down, and sent to the platforms in a more expedited and direct way. So that was another creative solution to deal with an immediate and urgent problem during a very specific period, which was the election period. And finally, the AI Special Legal Experts Commission. So Brazilian Senate, Brazil is trying to regulate AI, and the Senate created a special commission composed only by legal experts to discuss and propose a bill to regulate artificial intelligence. So the commission organized public hearings, tried to conduct this multi-stakeholder process, but being a lawyer, I think I can say that I think there were too many legal experts involved and not much people from other technical community, especially when AI is a really specific and technical matter. So I think that and also the final text that were proposed was not put under public consultation, as for example, the Brazilian Bill of Rights was. So I would say that we really we talk about a lot of multi-stakeholder process, but again, it was interesting to see Frit's question saying who come from the business background and other kind of backgrounds here, which I normally lawyers and legal experts try to dominate this discussion. So just to finalize, I think it's clear that platform regulation is a real complex problem and needs to be tackled in a variety of ways and by different backgrounds, and not just legal experts, but tech specialists, journalists, and also platforms themselves. And one of maybe the starting points to try and identify where we have consensus, right? And just as a way to inspire here, reading about the proposal of the Center of Justice and Governance Innovation, which proposed the creation of the Digital Safety Board, which again was inspired by the Financial Safety Board created after the financial crisis, which would be this multi-stakeholder group with the role of first suggesting standards, then monitoring and implementing. So if we could just focus on this first one, which would be trying to find consensus on, for example, which content should be online. Would it be interesting to map, I don't know if that's been done yet, like, for example, among platforms on terms, on standards, like which are the behavior and content that are not allowed in most of them? Like there will probably be a lot of overlaps, but then when I having identified that, what are the real challenges and obstacles to really make the implementation of these standards? Like how could other people be helping and trying to identify and having them as part of the conversation to really try and implement in practice what their own terms say? So how do global companies could apply these global norms, but also leave space to contextual nuances to be observed? So these are really important questions that I hope we'll be being able to discuss here. And maybe just trying to identify those consensus could be may help break the ice of these conversations, and maybe presenting a smoother starting point of the conversation and of this endeavor of creating this global norm instead of these all regional patchwork of regulations. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, we will have Alison Gilward.
So I suppose the question we were asked was, are there any lessons that can be learned from previous regulation? And I think now the original discussion on this, I was definitely not. This is completely different. It's just so disruptive and new and complex that we need to think completely differently. And I think people are suggesting something of the same. But I think, I think it's important to understand why that is the case. And I think as a former broadcasting and telecommunications regulator, are there really no lessons that we can learn from this process, which has kind of defaulted into a no regulation framework with enormous consequences for democracy, society, for economy. So, the issues that we're looking at in terms of past regulation, are we dealing with sovereign national jurisdictions, even if they are, regulatory states with delegated powers? No. Have we got is policy able to require delivery of national policy objectives through economic regulations, such as universal access, quality of service, price control, prevention of harms, local innovation? No, not really. In terms of competition regulation, critical to this environment, are we able to ensure fair competition within and between markets and consumer welfare outcomes? Not really. In terms of our institutional arrangements that we require in order to have the balance of interests and power and to ensure autonomy in regulation and impartiality, are we able to do that currently? No. In terms of delegated state authority to dedicated specialized agencies, which was part of the regulatory state framework that allowed us to deal with these complex developments, digital developments in the past, are these able to enforce these public interest outcomes any longer? No, they're not able to. So, sorry, I'm mine. If we can click on to the next one, thank you. And so, if we think about what we are dealing with, we're dealing with these, extremely disruptive, dynamic, complex, adaptive systems. These are, quite different from the distinct infrastructures, the very, market that we could identify and deal with in terms of quite static instrumental economic and competition regulation. That, in fact, has been quite ineffectually dealt with in the past, but also, if it is done instrumentally, is potentially damaging in the new complex environment, which, as has been pointed out, does have opportunities and solutions for us, and could particularly in developing countries actually damage innovation that would come out of constraint, that would come out of a different context. So, and where there's a lack of often state-enabled innovation. In terms of content producers in our platforms, they're operating across multiple jurisdictions. They're not subject to national law, and very often not enforceable at the national level, not beyond some very basic things. So what we're seeing is a changing interplay between states and markets and citizens that used to form the institutional arrangements of our previous regulation. And what instead we are seeing are new conceptualizations of public and new conceptualizations of private, with the private delivery of public goods, but often with the abdication by states, by governance systems of the public interest management of those delivery of public goods, because they are privately delivered. In fact, at a time that they require greater diligence and regulation, because they're being delivered by private interests. And so what we have is a complementary, contradictory, parallel systems of governance that are largely ineffectual in managing the extractive and often harmful practices of big tech and of these monopoly platforms. What we also have is very little normative consensus. So we've been, making these arguments on the grounds of, Western democratic normative frameworks that have guided us, whereas in fact, large numbers of the people in the world don't conform to those, and certainly large numbers of states. And as a result, we've got these really two polarized systems at the moment. And across the world, highly asymmetric flows of information that are really, reminiscent of the concerns that we had when we were discussing the New World Information Order, 40 years ago, 4 decades ago. Changed circumstances, maybe even more concentrated. But those countries, African countries or global South countries that have been marginalized from these information flows remain so. And so it's important when we're having these discussions today and we're talking about content regulation, specifically in big tech platform regulation, that we realize that we are actually talking about something that, the majority of Africans are not affected by. A lot of people in the global South have no access to these things. They're invisible, they're underrepresented, and they're discriminated and marginalized from. So what can we do about it? And I think that's an important part of, what we need is sort of fundamental, structural change to the economy and society to deal with these inequities, which is a long-term goal. And there's certainly things that I would argue for in terms of economic regulation. But what can we do now? What can we do at this stage? And so I think the important thing to do is to understand sort of evolving forms of global governance and what we can do in the short term, the medium term, and the longer term to understand, what has worked in the past, why things no longer work. But the main problem with many of these assumptions and these discussions that we're having, that they're based on assumptions about democracy, they're based on assumptions about human rights, and human development, and institutional endowments in countries, competitive markets, and various conditions that simply don't exist in many parts of the world. We're demanding online digital rights that don't exist offline, and we're wondering why the systems aren't working. But let's remind ourselves of what we have had and what we can have in future. We've traditionally had multilateral organizations, which are membership based, and those decisions have been made in terms of the political systems within those member states. That increasingly shifted over the last 2 decades to forms of shifts from government to governance with multi-stakeholder models, including private sector, public sector, or the state and civil society. Increasingly, what we have seen is the private regulation of public goods. So not the public regulation of private delivery, but the private regulation of public goods, such as with ICANN, where you have a still regulated, technically regulated, strongly regulated system that is privately regulated, but is delivering these public goods. And then in the area of content and other parts of the internet and internet governance, the non-technical part, essentially we've had no regulation. There's been this has been the essence of the internet. It's free and open, but in fact, by default, has become increasingly fragmented. There have been pressures for self-regulation of various kinds. And increasingly what we're seeing described as self-regulation is actually solo regulation. So it's this regulation by an entity, Facebook with its own oversight board, as opposed to the self-regulation, regulatory concepts we used to have of industry associations that would self-regulate around some sort of parameters. And then, of course, what we're seeing is increasingly enforced regulation, which has a whole range of concerns as we try and assert the state's responsibility for these things in actually controlling and overseeing industry regulation, arguably in the way that we've seen with India recently, and the appeal on content regulations to the courts that could, open itself to political manipulation. And so what we really need is a reconstitution of public regulation. What we need to all work towards is the global governance of digital public goods. Go to the next slide, please. And so I suppose, in thinking of what we can learn from our previous lessons, I would argue what we can draw from that, but which we need to adapt, is the notion of information as a public good. If we're trying to reconstitute public regulation at a global level, this is a basis to start from. And I'm going to try and deal with this in its kind of classical and economic regulation sense, because I think it's used very broadly as being in the public interest or being good for the public. But I think it's important from a regulatory point of view that if one understands this as a classical, economic good or an, imperfect public good or a merit public good, that you can actually regulate it in such a way that acknowledges its important role as an input in democracy, as an important input in the economy, and that is that it's not, that it's non-rivalrous and it's non-excludable. And it kind of goes to the ideas of public broadcasting, that in the use of that information, of somebody getting that information, it doesn't diminish the possibility of other people using it. Of course, it has been made highly excludable by commercialization and by monetization, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, as we see with public broadcasting models and common data lakes, models that we've seen. And so I think it's important that we look at some of these alternatives to understanding sort of information and data value, not only as private value creation, but also how we can create public value out of these data and how we can secure that public value. If we can go to the next slide, as we're running out of time. And so I think it's, there is increasingly a bit of literature that we can look at on the changing nature of global governance of these global digital public goods. And this will require us to manage these in a global way at a global level. I mean, there's a lot of work done, fabulous work done by Inge Carl and others that extrapolate the notion of public goods from the national to the global level and show that non-excludability and non-rivalry can happen at the global level. And it's this kind of discussion that we should be having, because then that raises the questions of who pays in a public good situation. We know that for education or broadcasting, that everybody is entitled to access, to be included, and therefore the obligation is on all of the governance structure to ensure that that happens. And so this raises questions for us, or allows us to address questions of inclusion and of access. I also think an important concept in the work of people like Betsy Geshu is this notion also that we're not thinking necessarily about public goods in the same way that we're thinking we're not thinking about public goods or public in the same way only as public sector. That the notion of publics now is a complex thing that can be monitored, delivered, and regulated by these multiple publics. So you can have, governance or monitoring of platforms by civil society as public entities, as the public sector as public entities. And so the notion of regulating the public good is now also an equally complex and agile concept to deal with its different. I'm going to have to end. If we can just go to the next slide, and I'm going to leave it up while you're finishing. But the important point I was wanting to make is that most of the regulation we're speaking about to date has been about negative regulation. It's about taking a quite narrow, individualized notion of human rights, of privacy, of freedom of expression and access to information, which are obviously completely critical and important to ensure harms. But it's essentially a negative regulatory perspective of dealing with breaches. It's not looking at how we can create a more inclusive and equitable system. And so we really need to look at what possible positive regulation there is to create these conditions that people can exercise these rights, look at alternative forms of access to information and into production of information, and to just really look more closely at the notions of concentration of ownership and power in these big monopolies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we will have a short discussion first between the speakers. Maybe does any of you want to react to what other speakers said or ask a question themselves? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm so processing the last presentation. A lot of content in there. It also makes me realize in other discussions, my realizations we're moving from a command and control to a connected, collaborate society because of the digital, because of the internet. But we're connected on a global level. And so I see technology, rationally, we already know we're in that fully connected world. Sorry. But we're still aiming to find solutions for that command and control world. So to some extent, I think we need to let go of the rules and regulations, how we've used to govern technology, and make a radical change, because the world we're trying to regulate is so rapidly changing. It's meant to be provocative, some expect us.
So, any reaction?
I think building on what the continuing of provocation, and I think linking with Alison's presentation now, maybe we are moving to shifting to a broader, to the concept of regulation. If we're just saying, well, are we now, should they, like platforms be seen as like media and communication companies, as broadcast companies, or what are the differences which are still there that would justify a different kind of regulation? Because I'm just saying that because one in Brazil, that's also a discussion that it's being led by one of the Supreme Court justices, saying, well, they are broadcasters, but are they really complete 100% equal to broadcasters, as in theory there is no there are third party content, and not necessarily they are the producers of the content, but when there all the algorithm and they decide who sees what, is that already enough to make them be seen equally as a media company, and what will be the impact of that in different places? For example, in Brazil, there are a lot of restrictions. If you're a media company, then one of them would be not no foreign capital can be part of the composition of a media company. Imagine that one with like platforms. So I'm just curious to see if that's one of the ways, because then another lots of impacts would have if we see them not as just simple media platforms, but as a real broadcaster and communication.
So I think I just further want to reply to it, because I think in identifying the information and the that information is now being platforms as a public good that should be regulated as such, and giving the example of free-to-air broadcasting as an example of that characteristic of non is about doing regulation. It's not to suggest that these platforms can or should be regulated. I think what it does raise is issues of unfair competition for those companies that are regulated like that are now competing against these platforms that have these kind of very stringent requirements. But I think that probably requires a review of how we regulate our media companies, which in fact enabling them to provide either through public digital infrastructure or through their own infrastructure networks. But I think it's quite unfeasible. I don't think we'll be able to enforce the kind of regulation. How are we going to get either language quotas or ownership infrastructure for them? So I think in suggesting that there might be a reconstitution of public regulation, it's really around the global governance of these public goods, including information, to redress these uneven distribution of not only harm but of opportunity. And I think that needs to be done through quite conscious economic regulation that will manage things like digital taxes and various that will allow people to compete, but also establish at a global level a set of principles that other countries are able to enforce and govern by. Because on their own, I think individual countries, never mind small African countries, but large countries can't do that regulation on their own. And so we need this sort of global cooperation, this global collaboration to enforce a rights-based framework that has also got standards around content regulation that collectively can be the language.
Thank you very much. Fernanda, do you want to add something?
I'm listening to you and think a little about the Latin America context, because in Brazil, for example, the media in a broad way, television, newspapers, is on monopoly of 5 families in all countries. So when we think about regulate platforms in this context, specifically, how to guarantee that this regulation will respect that our history, our culture, but at the same time maintain, expand the human rights. So I don't know if I'm clear, but it's so complex. Think about a global cooperation because of the power relationship between the countries, between regions, and how we can think about a good solution or a good cooperation that respects countries respect our histories, and at the same time guarantee that we are sustaining the human rights. It's so complex. In Brazil, for example, we are seeing the movement of the law from companies, from TV, from newspapers, and how balance all the things and not forget the academic civil society and the relationship with the other countries in the region. So it's it's you mentioned that how examples we have of anything that works good, works well. I don't think an example about it. So it's like we need to be creative. We need to be challenge the all things that we have as a model and build other things. But what? What build? And I don't know.
There are not, or do you want to react, or if there are not further reaction, maybe before having the discussion with the room, maybe I could ask another question with another, what could be the for and the dots and don'ts for platform regulation that we can learn from regulation of specific other sector. I would say, for example, climate regulation, because we often say that we could inspire about that, having each year conference, world conference, and as Christophe Deloire mentioned, it was a project of Forum 2, and I worked last year with him to buy something that we named equivalent of the IPCT for platform regulation. But do you think out of the metaphor that it can be a real example? What are the similarities and the differences? What do you think about this example?
I mean, I often drawn on, I think the lessons from climate change in particular are very important around, global agreement, building global consensus, and getting, and formalizing regulation. I think that the challenge for us in terms of platformization and the complexity that we're dealing with is that we're dealing with regulating a global monopoly, number of global giant platforms at a national level, whereas the climate change problem is basically trying to look national government to flip to that they have control of, that they can nationally. So it's a kind of inverse problem, lots to be learned around global collaboration, cooperation, but the actual regulatory challenge, the wicked kind of policy challenge, is a different one.
Think about the question. I think what we can learn from the climate discussion. I think the climate discussion, there's a burning platform. We know it's naturally being solved. And I think for our discussion, I think it's not always clear enough what's the burning platform, what is the problem that we're solving.
I think just maybe making the link I think to the next panel, which maybe is the issue of the realization of things now, like because and I tend to try and separate, for example, thinking about disinformation, the individual kind of disinformation that sometimes it happens just not intentionally, but like people are sharing within a very limited amount of control of story truth. And where is as the difference of those that are really trying to, with intention and with money, make spread that information? Because then there's like freedom of expression, but is there a right? You have the right to freedom of expression to say what you think within the legal safeguards and boundaries. But do you have the right to? Is that the same as wanting to make your your message reach everywhere and anywhere and anyone. Because then there's one of the ways to try to tackle the problem, which I guess it has passed through revising all those tools of like monetization, how companies really make the decision of accepting which kind of content that can be widespread, since they have their own rules of saying that some many content are not allowed to be. But shouldn't we ask for more transparency on how this mechanism works?
I think the question, definition of the question is very important. Before going to the audience, the other side, the other example is banking for financial regulation. Not the same kind of regulation. It's more something that common point of finance is systemic, but something that has a tendency to escape all the national regulation, and the regulation was dialed with very specific progressive norms, the process toward transparency and accountability. So maybe it could be the other goal and the other example that we could take inspiration from.
Perfectly. Yeah, thinking about the financial system makes us like think: is it how comparable would it be if, for example, the banking system is really more like centralized, and the nature of what we're discussing is, I don't think there's not as nuances as we have with context and regional differences as we have when we're talking about speech, right? Ultimately, if we're talking about information, and how like they are very specific, and then reminds me of the human rights discussion of universities versus relativism. Like, what are the things that are really that we can I think maybe find consensus on something like principles and on overarching rules, but when it goes to implement it on the ground, how do we make space for respecting the differences of each contextual place, right? So I understand that like the idea, but in practice, I think there's, because of the nature of what you're talking about, it's a bit different.
Have to realize that also the financial system is being disrupted today. I mean, the promise of blockchain disrupting the financial market means it's not a stable example. But I also want to come back to a remark which Alex made about positive regulation as an example to regulate digital platforms. I want to quote work done by Professor Alex Edmonds from the London Finance School. Now, he wrote a book called Grow the Pie. And it's basically research in big corporates which demonstrates if you take a long-term profit, you can only get there if you align profit and purpose. So it's an example of industries where a lot of research has demonstrated that companies being more profitable if you take a long-term view. Realizing that the platforms you're talking about also have economic value. Urge them to take a long-term perspective that might incentivize them to also align their profit with purpose. So what we're trying to then achieve is a benefit from their alignment with profit and purpose.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add something?
Uh, just one thing that I was thinking now. Sometimes when we talk to regulation of platforms, it's common that we think about a perspective of punishment of platforms, or how we can make them liable of the third's content. And I think some contexts, as Brazilian example, demonstrated us that sanctions and justice is not enough to control this problem. Return to your question, what problem we need to solve. And one experience that we had in Internet Lab is the Observatory of Political Violence. And in this context, we understood that content moderation is not the only answer that we need. We need more, we need transparency, we need assets, data to research. But at the same time, I think it's important to consider that we need to give autonomy to users, because if you are thinking as the difference between global and north and global south, it's clear that the way of platforms directed to each of these regions is different. So if we defend technical systemic change in design of platform, maybe we can offer some opportunities to these users, make different things in their platforms, social media. So we need to conjugate at the same time a collective look and individual look, because it's necessary to think in a technical and a practical way how we can improve the system that we have today. And we know the dynamism is so fast that we need to create something that could be changed if you need, but the design of platforms, the architecture is a thing that we can't forget.
I think obviously there's something that we learn from different kinds of governance, but I really think the issues of financial regulation are just, so fundamentally more manageable than the issues we're talking about. I think, the Secretary General of the UN has identified the way in which we govern climate change and digitization as a determinant of the degree to which we are going to exacerbate or reduce inequality over the next decade, 2 decades. This is how central it is to getting this right. It's not a technical thing that we can kind of agree on the techniques and get interoperability and it works. It's so complex, it's so adaptive. It has the potential to subvert our electoral processes and our democracy. I think banking regulation is important, but I don't think it necessarily has all those impacts, even with challenges. It's just a far more complex area.
Thank you very much. So we have now we'll be left to debate with the audience. We have 2 questions. Serena.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So I'm Serena Tirana from Pusaco. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you today. Thank you very much to Florian to being there, and thank you to the speakers for their very insightful presentations and discussions. So I have 2 questions from the online audience. The first one is for Fernanda and Celina. So considering the Brazilian experience, should the platform regulation model be preventive or repressive of behaviors? Is it technologically possible to be preventive? What does the experience of the Supreme Court's expert group teach us about the effectiveness of this type of gatekeeper against disinformation and hate speech in social media, considering the cap against democracy on August 1st, 2008?
Let me repeat it.
Maybe I can repeat. It's yes, a question for Fernanda and Celina, considering the Brazilian experience. Should the platform regulation model be preventive or repressive of behaviors? Is it technologically possible to be preventive? What does the experience of the Supreme Court's expert group teach us about the effectiveness of this type of gatekeeper against disinformation and hate speech in social media, considering the coup against democracy on 1/8. I don't know what it is.
Maybe, okay, thank you for the question. And as was asking about this example of the Supreme Court, the electoral Supreme Court, and if it should be, is it possible to be technologically possible to be preventive or just repressive? I think, as Fernando was beginning to say, like, if you cannot just leave it to technology to try and get the answers because of all that nuances that we were saying. But I think what that example shows is the importance of collaboration and of openness to be working together, and to see if how each one can collaborate. For example, the Supreme Court got all the indications of all of these disinformation links, right, website, and helped in making and identifying and suggesting, and then as a court order to remove that content. So it was like it had a part of like society, like open, like a crowdsourcing experiment, in which channel to that to the analysis of the electoral court, which then channeled to the companies where they could do something effectively. So I think it at least shows, if we are open and creative, that different solutions for different problems, and maybe in which maybe it's the case, there's like no bulletproof or no like a silver bullet for anything. But then if you try and modulate, well, let's tackle this and this problem that way, and then which can maybe give ideas to tackling different problems in different ways, which can be different in other countries. So I think that's a starting point.
Thank you, Serena, for the question. I think you touch in very, very important points. As Serena mentioned, in last election, we had the experience to work in collaboration, academics, civil society organizations, justice, and we realized that despite of it was a incipient experience and the first experience, this collaboration demonstrated that it's possible do more that we had to do in the other situations. But the problem is sometimes we see that the idea of prevent or repress in Brazil is so mixed, including not just the far-right groups, but progressist groups. In last election, many civil society organizations, many other activists was very interested in facing this challenge, in change the way that we think about disinformation, about platforms. But it's like people understand the freedom of expression as a way to guarantee that only the things that they believe is online, not the different points of views. So the history of Brazil is a history marked by authoritarian governments, authoritarian repressors. So how we can make this discussion, make this collaboration, because it's like a structural problem, not just platforms, but in all society. So I think it's possible to use technological things to mitigate these problems, but we need a collaborative work with all people interested in this discussion, and at the same time think about education, because in case of disinformation, for example, in our research about messaging apps, we discovered that it's not, people don't know what is fake news, but there is a dispute, a social dispute related to what I believe and what I want to spread on platforms. So it's more complex than we imagined before. It's complex because it's a huge polarization in Brazil and in other countries. So the change is structural, not only things related to platforms, but we need to think all things together, human rights and digital rights in the same basket.
Thank you very much for your answers. Yeah.
You have another question?
Yes,
Do you have
yes.
other?
I have another question on a slightly different topic from the online audience. So the question is, the speakers discuss the fact that the content moderation landscape is fragmented and relies on self-regulation, which can be dangerous for freedom of expression. What do you think of transparency reporting standards on content moderation practices to reduce fragmentation while improving human rights online? Should I repeat the question or? I'm going to write it.
Yes, please repeat the question.
Yes. So the speakers discussed the fact that the content moderation landscape is fragmented and relies on self-regulation, which can be dangerous for freedom of expression. What do you think of transparency reporting standards on content moderation practices to reduce fragmentation while improving human rights online?
So I think this is an important question of transparency, and I'm sure there are a number of people in the room who I know would like to speak to that. I think the different kind of instruments we require to reduce fragmentation would include transparency, but transparency on its own wouldn't be sufficient to include that. I also think we need to, when we ask for transparency, we need to be kind of far clearer on what we want in transparency on, because I think there's quite a lot of transparency whitewashing. So we tick the box on transparency, but we actually don't really know what motivated those decisions and stuff. So I think some sort of standards around reporting and transparency, and that would certainly are very important. I think a number of people are working on that. As I said, I think in and of themselves, if I understand the question correctly, that would support efforts to prevent further fragmentation of the internet, but I'm not sure that the expressions on their own. In fact, I'm quite sure they are.
Thank you. Another one as well, because I think we have a question in the audience directly. You have it, yes.
Okay, it's working? Okay, my name is Michael Bauermann. I'm director of the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Germany. I think Alison used an important hint as speaking about the private delivery of public goods. And of course, we can have the governance of public goods are commons by the state, by regulations, and we can, as Ostrom told us, we can have self-governance of the commons. And I would be interested about this relation and maybe your experience about this relation, because regulations, of course, can be substitutes for the self-governance of people, but they could also enable people for self-governance. They can grant rights for using their power in a self-governance process. On the other side, the civil society can support regulations and implement them and support them in acting. So I would be interested, especially about your experience in different nations, maybe, and your general view on this relation between governance, regulation, and self-governance by the people or by the civil society. Thank you.
In your view?
So, I think this is at the heart of of what we're discussing, and I think it can take many forms. I think the kind of past dependencies that we've got on in regulation are that a lot of what were public goods or public utilities or public provisioning that was not done often with a lot of citizen consultation, but was done in the public interest. and ensured that there were, for example, universality, quality kind of measures to what was done, to various effects, to different effects. But I think with the privatization and liberalization of markets that we saw around communication markets, of course, in media we already had commercialization, but I think the amplification of that with these digital platforms, and the very different unmediated nature of content on these platforms. Firstly, in the first instance, with the commercialization of private broadcasting, or even the privatization of the public communication systems, there was very often a abdication of the regulatory function. Sometimes there was a notion of governance, of multi-stakeholderism that would take care of it, but that very often, unless it was enforced through some kind of mechanism or structure, just didn't take place. So, I think we've got different examples of successful self-regulation of, specifically the print industry around many countries have avoided, sometimes been able to avoid state regulation and censorship by setting up their own instruments. I think these do need to be enabled by regulation so that they are required to have due process, so that they're required to consult with citizens. Many of these mechanisms that we're trying to set up, various forms of regulation, just have assumptions or indicate that there's some participatory process by citizens. But in many, in fact, most, I would argue, is actually very little consultation, or consultation is simply a checkbox where there's a public submission process, and the only people, the only entities that have the resources to participate in those public processes, particularly when there's big interest at stake, are the private sector. And so that becomes the public process. So, I'm not sure that that's answering the necessary nuances of your questions, but I think in a lot of the mechanisms that we're talking about, when we talk about multi-stakeholderism, there's really a need for kind of an interrogation of what that means in practice in different forums. That in fact, there's very often not these multiple sectors represented. So in some areas, the member states are overrepresented without necessary input from the private sector and civil society, like many UN organizations, which are primarily membership-based. On the other hand, many of those countries, but not all of them, have the democratic prerogative to be making policy by countries. But then that democratic prerogative is kind of carried through where many countries are not actually democratic, and who's representing them in these forums is problematic. And so then you get to the governance of these things, the participation, of sense of participation of certain parts of civil society from certain countries in things like the Internet Governance Forum. Actually, very little participation, particularly by African states, so very underrepresentation, I would say. Real overrepresentation of big tech, American companies, but actually very little representation of private sector in Africa at those meetings. And then again, and I'm one of them, the same very kind of small elite representatives of civil society that are often, making claims on behalf of people, in the face of countries that have a democratic prerogative to be determining that policy and representing their citizens. So I think it's complex, and I don't think we've adequately set up the systems to enable effective participation. We need to consciously not just say it's a participatory process, or it's a consultative process. How do we enable people who are affected by that to actually participate in that, and compete against big companies who are bringing in multi-million rand consultants on an issue? And I don't think we scratch the surface on that.
Your question reminds me of a small anecdote I'd like to share with you. When we organized the very first summit on accountability in The Hague, I was talking to a gentleman of a very big, prestigious organization in the States. Said, "Hey, I'd like you to come to The Hague and talk about your perspective on how we're going to organize accountability." His very first reply was, "Well, then I would be coming to Europe, and Europe has this state-regulated approach, and we'd like to have this industry-led approach." So that was already a clash of visions. So my reply was, well, you're actually coming to The Hague, which is a UN city. So your perception of how we're going to regulate is going to be just as valid as a European perspective. And also we have to realize that when we have that discussion in Europe, it's going to be a European dominated point of view because there are going to be Europeans in the room and not people from Africa or America. But the mere fact that we acknowledge that you have a different perception on how to regulate, made him willing to come, and that made us willing to have the discussion in the first place. So I think finding a common solution starts with acknowledging both systems have merit. And you should not first have a discussion, okay, it has to be one or the other. Listen to what both bring to the table and see if you can find common ground. And that's what we've been trying to do now.
Thank you. We just have time for 2 more questions in the audience. So you were first, I think. So, please, very short and because we have, as you all know, we have sound problem in the room and it's.
I am Javier Ruiz, Senior Advisor to Consumers International, the global network of consumer groups, and we are very interested in the mention that you made, Alison, about the economic aspects. So obviously, for us, things like consumer manipulation and deceptive designs, are linked to information, and so we straddle across the domains. But my question was around how do we marry this global regulation of information as public good with other initiatives? So most of our time we actually spend not at UNESCO but at UNCTAD, for example, we're looking at the value of data, not as public good but as the value of data. Or in particular now at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, where there is a whole initiative to regulate the digital space from the perspective of digital trade. And I think when we are looking at regulating foreign platforms, particularly, you start hitting in many issues around trade and what you can or cannot do. So that was my guess. That would be quite useful to understand how do you see, or how can we connect these two spaces if possible.
Thank you. These are all sort of very large pieces on their own. I actually think the concept of digital public goods is actually what allows us to traverse the domains and retain the public good aspects of it and also the public interest aspects of it. So we also engage with other parties in this room in UNCTAD forums and their information economy reports, data economy report, the last one. Of course, the WTO's got a whole set of different interests, but let me deal with the more kind of UN type organizations. So I think it's not that actually we put on our digital public goods hat when we're dealing with UNESCO, or you feel that then we have to go to the trade area or whatever. I think it's exactly taking this argument and trying to secure a space, a space for the common, a space for digital infrastructure, a space for public value in what are very commercial value driven entities. I think particularly if you check, if you're taking the World Trade Organization, if the notion of digital public goods had actually even got onto the table, you wouldn't have the moratorium on, e-commerce and that sort of thing, which is, entirely driving a very particular, kind of e-commerce and big corporation kind of agenda on those things. So I really see it as the instrument in which to move around these fora and try and find this common regulatory area, but it's not easy. I concur. And I think it's just also very critical to the competition discussion. The competitions around all digital services here, but even in other parts of the world, we've got issues around competition and consumer protection regulation, what it means in this environment, and how as I said before, the kind of old instrumental application of these trade rules or these competition rules or these consumer protection rules in this environment can actually have severe unintended consequences that are arguably worse than if they were trying to be addressed. And I just wanted to say there were some hands right at the back of the room.
I have another question here. Yeah. No, but
Question. Hi, my name is Helani Galpaya, CEO of Learn Asia, think tank working in South Asia and Southeast Asia. One question for Selena on how far do you think the election-related multi-stakeholder initiative can be pushed? Because elections are a particular phenomena, incredibly important, but in emerging economies, the real game is in between, the day after you win the election, in all the horrible things governing parties do to make sure they win the next election. So would that model work in a very extended period of time where it's not simply about fact-checking? And even for fact-checking, the data required for fact-checking is not in the public domain, so you can't even refute half of these stories, right? Developing countries just don't have the data for checking algorithmically or humanly. So how far in time and scope do you think this model can be expanded beyond a very limited election, bit before and after? And for the panel, I'd like your thoughts on the so-called self-regulatory mechanisms that are being pushed by coalitions of, Google, Facebook, etc. New Zealand, Australia, they've passed a code of self-regulation by the Asian International Coalition. They're trying to do this in many other countries, in part as a way of avoiding government regulations, so that they're trying to move this fast so that the governments look at that and say, well, we don't have to regulate. Are you cynical? Are you hopeful? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I'll try to be quick. So, as you rightly pointed out, this was an experiment that had a very specific time frame, which maybe that's why it was kind of successful in the sense that all stakeholders were open to do it, right? But and I think that's really the challenge on how to make this or other kinds of approaches more not just in one specific time, and how to make it to extend it during these periods in which the social platforms are still used by these groups to make their points, and also envisioning the next election. So I think one of the good things was that it created like a precedent that can be used, and then like that door has been opened, and now I guess that it has rooms for just as this experiment will be published and will be it will be made, and then more people will get to know, and then will be pushed, create the possibility to be pushed forward and to create spaces for other kinds of solutions, right? Like Brazil is now pushing for regulation for media, for social media. The new government is really into that, and also thinking about different possibilities of trying, or maybe try and create like a sandbox kind of initiative to certain types of content. So just to make it short, I think it was just a first step, which will certainly be, I think, a build upon.
yes.
Just the question of self-regulation. I think it's an important one, Helani. I think what I was trying to emphasize earlier is that we've now got sort of different kinds of self-regulation. And often when we talk in these things, we kind of just defaulted into one kind. And so often what is now being described as a solo regulation. So as I said, the very obvious one that comes to mind is obviously Meta and the Oversight Board, where the organization is really regulating itself, not as part of an industry. And, I think a lot of people have seen a lot of positive things about that, but there are also inherent problems with regulating yourself on your own standards, etc. So I think, moves towards self-regulation of an industry, of a set of people who are facing the same regulatory issues, is a positive step. If those issues of the standards on transparency, on reporting, on auditing, etc., can be set for those, so that they can be effectively monitored and regulated, because this, no state is going to be able to actually do that monitoring and do that. We want those big companies to pay to do that. So I think these initiatives are useful, but I do think they require, a legislative, a regulatory framework that sets the terms of that industry regulation without, as I said, the kind of state control that we might be seeing in the state in frameworks that have been set up in India with the
I'd like to add to that, the minute you go for self-regulation without any, we should say, public governance, you're going to be in a very dangerous ground. But I think the good thing is what you see changing, at least in Europe, that you're moving from a rule-based legislation to principle-based legislation. And that allows us more freedom, that allows us more speed to, you can still come up with your self-regulation as an entity, as long as you adhere to these principles. So you can probably look at the hybrid model, but if it's going to be 100% self-regulation without any governance, that's dangerous ground.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry to interrupt, but time is going. I will have to close this roundtable. So thank you for all the speakers. Thank you for all the audience.